everybody. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Muriel. I'm the Associate Curator here at Contemporary Calgary. I am really happy to be in conversation with Marigold Santos and Bianca Miranda tonight, and thanks so much for joining us. Before we start, I would like to take a few moments to acknowledge this beautiful land on which we are gathered, which is the home of the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy comprising the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Goodstoney First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta Districts 5 and 6. Today's conversation, which I'm very excited about and which will be very informal, as I'm sure you've guessed from the giggles we were having right before introducing the talk, is centered on Marigold Santos' writing practice and the labor and art of translation. This conversation is organized in conjunction with Marigold and Rajni Pereira's exhibition, Efflorescence, The Way We Wake, which is on view in the Ring Galleries just next door. And if you haven't seen it, I encourage you to see it. There's a lot to be said about Marigold's work in this exhibition, but the focus of the conversation tonight is really about her venture into writing. The exhibition had rather, because we recently just ran out of them. We printed 1,000 copies of a really lovely booklet of poetry that Marigold had written, accompanied by translations in Tagalog by Bianca Miranda. And even though we ran out of the copies, we're very happy we ran out because it means people were taking them and enjoying them. And anyway, it is accessible you can download the PDF on our website on the exhibition page. But anyway, we'll get to that later. But first, I want to introduce Marigold and Bianca, even though I'm sure many of you here already do know them. Marigold Santos was born in the Philippines and immigrated with her family to Canada in 1988. She pursues an interdisciplinary art practice that examines notions of heritage, folklore, motherwork, and decolonization presented within the otherworldly. Her paintings, drawings, sculptures, and tattoo work explore selfhood and identity that embrace multiplicity, fragmentation, and empowerment, as informed by diasporic experiences. She holds a BFA from the University of Calgary and an MFA from Concordia University. As a recipient of grants from the Canada Council for the Arts, the Alberta Foundation for the Arts, and the Conseil des Arts et des Lettres du Québec, she continues to exhibit widely across Canada. Bianca Miranda was born and raised in the Philippines and is a queer Filipino theater artist who is grateful to be living and working in Makinsis Treaty 7. She is the producer at Downstage, theater that creates conversation around current issues. As a theater maker and playwright, their works most often start from a personal place and examine the intersections of her identities, born out of the necessity to tell stories of her communities that are underrepresented on stage. She is the writer of Kisap Mata, is that right? And co-writer and performer of The F Word with Keshia Cheeseman. They believe in the transformative power of storytelling. We had spoken before starting about potentially having Marigold and Bianca read an excerpt from the poetry. Are you comfortable doing that still?
Hello. Yes. Hello. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. So this is the book that Contemporary Calgary had printed. Like Muriel said, there was 1,000 copies, and fortunately, unfortunately, they've all been taken. But if you haven't gotten a chance to read this, there is a copy inside the Ring Gallery, and then as Muriel mentioned, you can actually download it. So if you wanted to make your own book, you could. So that's just a way to democratize this even more. Okay, so in the book, there are 4 poems, and we're going to be reading one of the poems. And it's translated in Tagalog, so I'm going to read, and so will Bianca. You ready?
Yeah.
Okay, so this is the fourth poem. Pressed between the pages, the liquid slipping into the fibers.
Nakapipi sa pagitan ng mga pahina. Ang likido nakakalusot sa mga hibla.
The skin of its kin,
Ang balat ng kamag-anak,
it dissipates and disappears.
ito'y nawawala at naglalaho.
Ochre and umber,
Ochre at umber.
like my thin and transparent
Katulad ng manipis at transparenteng
umbilical cord that my father kept between paper and his wallet.
kordon ng pusod na itinago ng aking tatay sa gitna ng mga papel sa kanyang pitaka.
Until it disintegrated.
Hanggang ito'y magkadurog-durog.
The weight and the heat grinding the dried lifeline into a powder, into dust.
Ang bigat at kainitan, sanhi ng pagkadikdik ng linya ng buhay, naging pulbos, naging alikabok.
Eventually and magically absorbed into the breath of every day.
Paglaon ng panahon at dahil sa kababalaghan, naging bahagi ng araw-araw na paghinga.
In the archives of the gardens, they see this one specimen.
Sa mga arkibos ng halamanan, nadiskubre ang isang specimen.
They mistake it for another.
Napagkamalang iba.
They find it is unique and new.
Tinuring nila itong kakaiba at bago.
The excitement dies.
Ngunit namatay ang pananabik.
It may already be extinct.
Maaaring lipol na ito.
On the side opposite to the smooth silver skin,
Sa tagiliran kasalungat sa makinis na silver skin,
are living ligatures
ay mga nababuhay na litid
that cross their fingers to stop the flow of blood.
na nagkukrus ng mga daliri upang mapahinto ang pag-agos ng dugo.
Where once it flowed freely, where it once cleansed and fed,
Kung saan malayong umaagos noon, nung minsay nilinis at pinakain.
and regulated, an organ created to sustain life, and then to be expelled, it dies, fragmented.
At pinatanatili, lamang loob na nilikha ng sagayon ay sumistento ng buhay. Pagkatapos iniluwal, ito'y namatay na pira-piraso.
It gives everything it has before it does,
Binibigay nito ang lahat bago pa man.
comprised of two parts,
Binubuo ng dalawang parte,
but housed in one body,
ngunit namamahay sa isang katawan.
attached to two bodies.
Nakakabit sa dalawang katawan.
Mother,
Ina, nanay, inay,
petals with long yellow nylon cord used to harness boxed shapes filled with tireless gifts.
mga talulot na may dilaw na nylon na lubid na ginagamit sa mga hugis ng kahon, puno na walang katapusang regalo.
The dry corpus of the pitcher plant imprints into itself.
Ang tuyong korpus ng pitsyel-pitsyel na halaman ay tumatak sa kanyang sarili.
The crease, tidy and sharp,
Ang lukot, malinis at matalas,
like a starched terno sleeve, pleats preserved.
katulad ng almirolang terno, ingat ang tupi.
Dissolved and once dissolving,
Naglaho at kung minsan naglalaho.
the vessel eats only itself.
Ang sisidlan ay kinakain ng kanyang sarili.
Bittersweet recognition of a time that has come too late, a discovery that feels unrequited.
Magkahalong matamis at mapait ang ramdam ko sa panahong uli na. Isang pagtuklas na walang kapalit.
But imperfect puzzles make new languages with succinct images of the heart.
ang hindi perpektong palaisipan ay nakakagawa ng bagong wika kasama ng maikling imahe ng puso.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Marigold and Bianca. It's funny because I have all of these questions that I prepared and sent you by email, but somehow hearing you read this made me feel like I want to ask a whole bunch of new questions. And I think there's something too about the visceral quality of the voice that obviously does not translate at all when you're reading something off a paper versus you're hearing it being read, which is how poetry is meant to be. It is meant to be performed and it is meant to be heard and listened to. Is this the first time that you read this together out loud?
Yes.
Yeah, like in this way for sure.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
That sounded so cool.
It sounded really great. Yeah. How does it feel to sort of revisit, well, the writing for you, Marigold, but also the translation for you, Bianca?
Well, Bianca and I were just touching base about that before this conversation started, and I said, yeah, I was reading it for the first time in a long time. I haven't really read these poems for months and months and months. And as I was reading it, I was like, this is good. I'm into this. And then Bianca had a different experience.
Yeah, I think the translation we did it, or I did it, was it a couple years now? Or
Yeah.
so revisiting work like this, I was like, oh, I would have made different choices for some of these, because I'm looking at it with a fresh pair of eyes, and I believe like for when I was working with some of these poems, it was also a really busy time for me. I was also putting on my own show, so like coming at it from like a fresh brain and having that space, I think as an artist that's so valuable to me. So yeah, but I love that it encapsulates like that time of where I was at
Yeah,
with the
100%.
translations. Yeah.
Yeah, and then I also commented that with Bianca. I was like, that's kind of the nature of your work, though. You know, like you are revisionist. Like you'll sort of perfect what you're writing and everything and tweak it and tweak it. Whereas like I make something and then I finish it and then I don't ever revisit again. Like I'm just so happy to visit it later, and it's like just like you said, it sort of encapsulates like a particular time. So I'm happy to see it, and then my thoughts are never to revise it. It's like I just never think that way, which is so interesting, and I love that.
I had a question for Bianca, which I mentioned to you briefly just before. And obviously, I don't read or speak Tagalog, and I had only really read the English version that Marigold had written. But sort of in preparation for this conversation, I did try to just look at them side by side, really look at them, and noticed for the first time that the word mother in the poem has three different translations that you included. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about that choice. And of course, the word mother has so many different words in English as well, but the very deliberate, I think, decision to include three different words for that one word in Tagalog.
Yeah, I think part of me was trying to encapsulate, like, there are just so many words for different, in terms of translating words in Tagalog, but I think it was important for me to, even just the way it sounded, there was something satisfying to it. And I don't even think I put what I call my own mom in there, so
What do you call your mom?
it's mama. But like I call my grandma nanay, and that was and I like the word nanay, inay. Like it, I think it was important for me to include those three because, like you said, this is meant to be performed, and I think even saying it right now, it felt like there was a gravity to saying the three. Yeah.
Yeah. I have all of these questions, but I guess one thing I wanted to talk about, another excerpt from the poem, which actually the title of the conversation is taken from a line from the poem, comprised of two parts, but housed in one body, attached to two bodies. And I feel like this spoke to me a lot, and also I feel like it really speaks to your work, Marigold. This idea of like hybrid cultures, these, I was reading your bio again, and this word otherworldly really struck with me. These kind of hybrid creatures that we see human, non-human, or maybe that they belong to something else, and how that really speaks to the experience of existing within a diaspora, or being uprooted and having to adapt to another culture and becoming hybrid creatures. As we try to do this, we retain part of ourselves, but we have to acquire new parts so that we can sort of adapt to these new places or these new cultures that we inhabit. And obviously, the both of you were born in the Philippines, and for the both of you, your mother tongue was Tagalog. And then we can get to the specifics of that later, but I was wondering about sort of the extent to which you associate that experience of kind of letting go of one language and learning another. How does that sort of speak to you and to your experience? Does within specifically this one line, which I think is such a beautiful line, Marigold.
Okay, that line, like I can go into what you're saying for probably half an hour, and I won't, but I will talk a little bit about it because it's such an anchor point. So my work, I would say, like my whole art practice and really like, and I can say that with confidence, and where the direction that I went into was, it started when I started thinking about language and thinking about, myself as an immigrant coming from the Philippines at a young age, learning one language, living your whole lifetime in that language, and then learning another one, and then completely forgetting that other one. So I don't speak Tagalog anymore. I understand it as fluently as I can. My parents speak it to me, my relatives speak it to me, but I respond back in English. And so I was like, what is going on in my brain that I can do that? And so that's really what started all of the work that I was making. Just asking these kinds of questions of like the transformations that we undergo. Um, and so one of the ways that I talk about all the themes in my work, like diaspora, resilience, transformation, fragmentation, hybridity, all of those things are always, explained or illustrated in some ways through my adoption of a Filipino folklore character called an aswang. So for some of you who are familiar with my work, you'll see that there's always like a figure or figures in my work, and I always call that figure an aswang. Traditionally, like in the Philippines, an aswang is sort of like this hybrid vampire witch creature. There's many different forms. It's a shapeshifter, but the one that I gravitated to is called a manananggal, and that translates to separate, or to sort of, yeah, to separate. And so this particular one divides in half. It has an upper body and a lower body that breaks off in the night, and it's a ghoulish character. So it goes out and it like hunts in the night, and it eats all sorts of living things. And then at the end of the night, it has to join back to its fragmented lower half. Otherwise, it'll die fragmented. So what I didn't realize is that I started to think about this like creepy figure as a way to talk about like an embodiment of diasporic experiences, where one half of you is like rooted somewhere else, and the other half is somewhere around, and then you're constantly trying to rejoin. And even though this like folklore character has like a history of violence and in itself is quite violent, in the work that I do, the figure is, reconfigured to talk a lot about, self-determination and empowerment instead of these violence, especially from colonial violence, because that's where she comes from, and that's a whole other thing. But so when we talk about this particular line that we're talking about, comprised of two parts, this is sort of what I'm referring to. But it's also referring to circle back to mother, is talking about, pregnancy and birthing and umbilical cords and placentas and all of those things, where we talk about like where we come from, where we're rooted, and then the biological sort of event that I went through, becoming a mother. So yeah, housed in one body. I talk a lot about the placenta and umbilical cord, and we can go a little bit into that later. But I just wanted to give that sort of over umbrella to talk about really like what that line is about.
Yeah, well, not used to this mic. I think for me, I moved here when I was 14, and I have to be honest, I don't know when I learned English or when I learned Tagalog. I mean, I think for sure, my first language is Tagalog, but as early as kindergarten, I think there was English in a lot of my education. So I kind of moved here with a different mentality in terms of I think 14 is a prime age where my core desire was to fit in and belong, and so or what that translated for me was I need to undo every part of myself that gives away that I'm other and that I didn't grow up here, and so actually my relationship to language is to be far away from it as possible. It was kind of like a little secret that I had because I spoke it at home and I still do to this day to my family members. But at school, I was very much, very, like I knew how to shapeshift. That's a great way to put it. And I knew how to observe and know exactly to pick up how to make myself um, yeah, like want to belong. Like that was kind of a survival thing for me. Um, and like of course I call it like little slips because there's a certain slang that you don't know and certain pronunciations of things that slip out. Like I think I remember comfortable was like a huge word.
Salmon, I think, is another one.
Salmon's another one. Yeah, I feel like those were like the telltales for me, where everyone's like, "What'd you say?" We don't say it like that, which I know is not an original experience. We've all had something like this, but I think as I grew up, uh, I'm like learning to love this language and like fighting my all to not lose it. And honestly, like there's been a few moments with my mom recently where she's like, I think you're trying to say this word, but that's not. That was not. So I feel a little bit pain and hurt in my heart that that's starting to happen. But yeah, I'm fighting my darndest to keep and preserve this language. Yeah.
No, and I kind of love and really relate to what you said about kind of the shape shifting or like these words that we don't necessarily know how to pronounce and trying to hide the fact that this isn't like our first language. And we've talked a bit about accents earlier. I don't know if this is a good segue to talk about that, um, but yeah, sort of trying to hide an accent is something I think that is sort of very crucial to the immigrant experience. It's like we have to sound like other people or sound like someone who speaks English, sound like a native, I guess, a native English speaker. Um, Marigold, you mentioned this just now, but we also talked about it before about how the year you learned English was also the year that you forgot to speak Tagalog, and how they happened sort of at the same time. And it was the year you moved here, and you were 7. So there was like this big event, and like through this kind of I guess there is a trauma to uprooting yourself in that way. And the result of that trauma was acquiring this new language and letting go of this other one. But while working on this book of poetry of yours and working with Bianca, you've had to sort of, I guess, relearn some of that. And maybe this is a good segue to play some of the clips, actually. But I was wondering if you could tell us more about the process of relearning your mother tongue through the while working on this poetry book.
So, I mean, like what Bianca touched upon is like when you're like a young immigrant, and it's such a shame that we feel so ashamed. And I certainly don't feel that now. And when you're a child, especially like when I had moved here, um, yeah, like it was a point of pride to want to like speak English, and it's so sad because had the climate been different and had things been different, I wouldn't have lost my language. You know, like my parents would have probably um, forced us to continue keeping that alive. But, you know, as it stood, they really, and I hate this word, but they really wanted us to assimilate. I'm sure a lot of immigrants in this room can relate to that. And again, like Bianca said, it's a survival mechanism that you sort of do. All this code switching, all this shape shifting, so you can survive. Um, and then as I grew up, I realized like I was like ashamed of my shame. I was like, this is terrible. And obviously, I was growing up as well. So I was like learning about myself, learning about where I come from, and wanting to feel empowered by that and not being ashamed. And all of this, like, the ways that we sort of become, you know, influenced by Eurocentric, white supremacist ways of thinking, you start to unpack that and you start to untether from that. And so, in a way, for me, in the ways that I make work and my effort of trying to decolonize, I really wanted to get in touch again with my language. But I was like, how am I going to do this? It feels so far away from me. And even though my parents would speak it to me, it just still felt so like inaccessible. And I would try and I would like watch like the Tagalog shows, or I would like read comics, and I could hear it in my head, but I could never form it, you know, and that was so frustrating. Um, so what I started to do is started to incorporate it into my work. At first, just little by little, like titling things in Tagalog, asking my mom, hey mom, how would you say this? You know, and it would involve her into my practice, which she was really excited about because up until this point, my parents were like, I don't really know what you're doing. Like, cool. And they would like on Facebook, like my posts, but they were just like, I don't know what that is. Um, and so like it was nice to sort of involve my parents, and then we could start talking about it. They're like, I was like, well, what are you trying to say in this? Like, do you mean this or this? And then that way it kind of opened it up, which was a really beautiful thing. And then little by little, I started incorporating it. I started to write some poetry. And then I was like, hey, I really want to write something for this next body of work I'm doing. And so I'll get a little bit into detail later, but to bring it back to Bianca, I had become friends with Bianca, and I immediately thought of Bianca as the person who could work alongside me for this. Like immediately, I was like, it has to be Bianca, for a lot of reasons, and we'll get into that, you know, when we talk about what Bianca does in their work. But yeah, so it was when Bianca and I first started. I had written the poems, and I said, Bianca, can you please help me recite these? I really want to make a soundscape. I want to recite this. And I was like unprepared because I didn't, all the words that I know are from like conversational Tagalog with my parents and not like poetic language. And so when Bianca came back with the translations and then I started to like recite it, I was like, okay, this is pretty hard. So, but we had recorded all of our sessions, and so I had given some to Muriel, and I listened to it for the first time. So here is like a little excerpt of. I don't think even Bianca's.
Paano ko matututunan para maituro ko ang kailangan? Okay, again.
Careful on the just for the
Para?
Yeah.
What should I, oh, was I saying it like?
It kind of slips into paro.
Paro? Okay. Para. Okay. Paano ko matututunan para maituro ko ang kailangan? Okay, one more time. Paano ko matututunan para maituro ko ang kailangan? Okay, one more time because that sounds funny. Paano ko matututunan para maituro ko ang kailangan? Paano ko ito mahahawakan? Well, how's that last sentence?
Yeah, that was good.
Okay.
Actually, can we go back to the first sentence?
Yep.
Just ngayon.
Ngayon. Ngayon. Ngayon. Okay, I'm going to say it again. Ngayon. Okay, after this airplane passes. Oh my god, it's like a flight time. We do. We're in the flight path, but like there's certain times of the day where they're like raging, and I guess it's right now. It's like all the flights noon time. Ngayon. Okay, here we go. Malapad na. Can you say that?
Do you want me to say the sentence?
Yeah.
Malapad na ngayon.
Na ngayon. Okay. Na ngayon. Okay. Malapad na ngayon dahil sa panganganak.
Panganganak.
Panganganak. Okay.
Thank you for listening to that. For those Tagalog speakers in the room, actually, who speaks Tagalog here? Can I see a show of hands? Oh, hello. Was that like so hard to hear?
I don't think so.
I mean, the language it's so beautiful and so like interesting the ways that it's like, and once if you don't speak it fluently and then you're reading it, it starts to just become like a jumble. You know, it starts to disintegrate and they just become sounds, and all of a sudden they start to separate from like what they actually mean, and then you're just, yeah, it was a really interesting process. Thank you, Bianca, for doing that with me.
Of course, it was my pleasure. I also think one of the notes that I gave you towards the end was obviously knowing your personality as Marigold. I was like, now give me some of that for the Tagalog, which was, yeah, I mean, but that's so hard because, you know, like we form our different selves, or at least that's what I find in like both languages. I feel, I mean, I'm not a completely different person, but there's, you know, like there's humor, there's sarcasm in each language. Like it informs personality. So yeah, it was interesting to watch that.
Yeah.
Too.
I think Muriel, actually, did you put one more? Okay, there's one more.
There's another one.
Yeah, there's one
I
more.
will admit, when you played this one and then there was the plane, I was like, oh no, I don't know if I clipped it exactly how Marigold, or like, did I choose a completely different excerpt? Like, is the plane supposed to be there?
So we're at 7 now. Perfect. Okay, Bianca, you say it, and then we're
Should we
gonna
do it
line by
separately?
line. Yeah, like paragraph by paragraph.
Nakapipi sa pagitan ng mga pahina, ang likido nakakalusot sa mga hibla. Ang balat ng kamag-anak, ito'y nawawala at naglalaho.
Okay. Oh, it sounds so beautiful in Tagalog. I love it so much. Okay. Nakapipi sa pagitan ng mga pahina.
Nakapipi.
Nakapipi. Nakapipi sa pagitan ng mga pahina.
Pahina.
Pahina. Pahina. Pages. Nakapipi. Nakapipi.
Nakapipi.
Nakapipi. Nakapipi. Okay. Next. Nakapipi sa pagitan ng mga pahina.
Pahina.
Pahina. Pahina. Pahina. Nakapipi sa pagitan ng mga pahina. Ang likido.
Likido.
Ang likido. Nakakalusot sa mga hibla.
Hibla.
Hibla. Oh, that's an L. Okay, I'm going to start again. It's nakapipi, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Nakapipi sa pagitan ng mga pahina. 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 Ay, yeah. One more time. Nakakapip, nakapipi, again. Nakapipi sa pagitan ng mga pahina.
It's all good. That was enough. Thank you.
That was the first line from the poem you read just now, right? I recognized it. Um, can you tell us a bit more about what it was like to work on this sort of together? And I also want to hear specifically from Bianca about the challenges of translation, because this was your first time translating. Anyway, it's a two-part question, I guess, but if you could tell us about the process of working together, and I would really love to hear more about the translating part, because I know this was your first time despite being a fluent speaker.
Yeah, so like I said, I had this idea where I wanted to write poetry, and I'll talk a little bit about the actual what the poems are about. I've got some slides for you, but just like in general, I really wanted to work with Bianca. I knew that Bianca had a grasp on the language. Bianca's amazing, so I was like, I really want to work with Bianca. And so my experience of working with them is that I had a really, I felt very comfortable. I didn't feel embarrassed. I didn't feel ashamed. I felt like vulnerable, but in a good way. And I felt like I was in really good hands. And because I had written these poems already and I was giving them to Bianca, I was like, okay, it's a little bit unfair for me to just expect you to understand what these poems are about. So I'm going to give you sort of like a Cole's notes on what each panel is about, like really briefly, so that you have some guidance when you do your translations. Because as many of you know, translation is not word for word. You have to trust this person that they have the creative skills and the imagination to go there with the poetry. So that was my experience with it, but I'm excited to hear about yours.
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge for me was asking myself, am I the right person for this? Because yeah, I think that always comes to my mind, and I I consider myself fluent in Tagalog conversationally, but I didn't reach the point of education where I read No Limitangere or any of the, like where you dive deep into Tagalog. So it was a real challenge for me as well. But I think like what helped it was you were so open about if you have a question about what a line means, just ask me, because if I had to guess, I think that would have been a completely different feat. And it's great because I like what we were talking about. I do have access to you. So, you know, sometimes these translations happen after someone's passed already. So that was, I consider that like a huge privilege. And I think the challenge is really for me, like there's so many words for certain things in Tagalog, and like the more you get more specific, the more descriptive they are. Like we have a ton of words for rice, like that alone, you know, each word means a different thing. Like bigas is uncooked rice, kanin is cooked rice, sinangag is fried rice. Like there's just so much choice. So to me, it really came down to. I think I had some conversations with you, kind of like what you had with your mom, where it was like, okay, this word means this. Are we going for this word or this word? Like, I think having those conversations with you, having conversations with my mom, she heard from me a lot during that time. And really also, the process that I know is my background is in as an actor. So I was saying these words aloud. I was saying these words aloud a lot, and I think it was like my nighttime like ritual of like just being with the words, and I have to be honest, I don't, they're not perfect, but to me, it's kind of like the exercise that you had of like saying these words. It became an exercise for my artistic practice as well that I consider, like, I'm so thankful to be trusted, and like the biggest fear that I had was just to do justice to your words, and even having the risk and the like attempt of doing this was huge to me. Anyway, sorry, I'm just, thank you.
Thank you.
um, but yeah, like I think some surprises are, or sorry, I don't know. I guess this is more about the challenges.
No, we can talk about the surprises.
Um, I lost my train of thought when I said that.
The unexpected pleasures of working with Marigold Santos.
And one thing I want to add is that, like, at this time while Bianca was working, like, you were in the middle of the F word.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
the F word was this massive play that Bianca, like, wrote and acted in and direct. No,
No.
not directed. But it had a long run, and it was at the Theatre Calgary. No.
Alberta Theatre Project.
Alberta Theatre Projects. And it was massive. And so, Bianca was like inserting this work during a super busy time in their life. And so I was just so grateful to have any time at all. But I think sometimes when you work under pressure, I don't know if you're like me, but when I'm under pressure, I make like my best work. I'm not sure if you're like that, but I mean, I think your translations are beautiful.
Yes, sometimes. But I think honestly, like, putting that as part of my ritual made me slow down because it was such a busy and fast paced time that it really forced me because I have to go word by word, but also ask myself, how do you say, it's just like, how do I phrase it in a way that kind of gets at what you're trying to do with a literary device as well. So,
And working with Bianca at this stage, too, I just have to add, is that it prepared me for when these works were translated in French because they were translated in French, which was when they exhibited in Montreal at the Fondation Phi. And so it was really cool to have the three languages. And then again, conversations with people being like, so in French, this is actually what we mean when we say this. But then it reads so different. It's not the way. And so there was so much back and forth with the French translations too. So it really prepared me for that, which I thought was really cool.
Yeah. Were there any specific words? I mean, we talked a little bit about how mother is translated into three words, but were there any specific lines that you feel like you spent a lot of time on, or there was a lot of back and forth that maybe you could share with us?
like, the answer is yes, but do I remember which lines those are? Not really, but I think. Oh, something that I also wanted to point out was Marigold talked a lot about like specimens. So I was like Googling, like, what the heck is this type of plant or like this type of animal? And then asking my mom, like, is this what you like? I had a lot of conversations with my mom. She was a great resource, but yeah, like it was because I have to understand what it is specifically. And there are honestly words where I had to be like, I don't know. And even looking at this, ochre and umber, I'm like, oh, I think I know how I would translate that now. Yeah, yeah.
Because also in in other languages too, that there isn't a direct word for that. Like, there are words that just don't,
Yeah.
exist. Should I click a slide?
Yeah, can we, if you could talk about, yes, it was my next thing, if you could talk about the poetry and how they relate to the words.
Yeah, so perhaps maybe we should have started with this, but that's okay. For those who have visited the exhibit in the Ring Gallery, you're going to see these 4 paintings. And when I made these 4 paintings, I had written this grant, And I was pregnant at the time. And I had written this grant for after, when I had already have a kid. And I didn't know what that was going to look like, right? I was like being very hopeful, like, yes, I mean, I don't know what it's going to look like. And so I didn't really know what the work was going to be, but I had these hopes. And initially, I had made this project where I wanted to talk about a folk dance in the Philippines called tinikling. And that folk dance involves 3 or 4 dancers or more. Usually there's 2 individuals at the ends. They're like the pacemakers, and they hold 2 very long bamboo poles. And they tap the poles in a very particular way to make a rhythm, like this, like that. And then the dancers dance in and out of the poles, and they to try to avoid having their feet. Well, not to avoid it, but they do avoid having their feet smushed by the poles. And then there's beautiful dance, there's beautiful music, and I really wanted to talk about this dance as a way to talk about a lived experience, how we sort of use dance as we move through the world, how our movement through the world and how our experiences are, in fact, a kind of dance. I used it to talk about like parenthood and whatnot. So you'll see here in the 4 paintings that they are enacting the dance, but each one has a different personality to them. And if you get close, you'll see that there's all these little Easter eggs, like in each one. Um, and as I was making these paintings, I was writing the poems because I didn't really know where the paintings were going, and I didn't really know what I was like really thinking about. Like, of course I knew, but I didn't know how to organize my thoughts. So the poems came out as a way to sort of not like automatic writing, but because it was more intentional than that. I definitely edited it and I wrote it with intent, but it was a way for me to organize my thoughts around what the work was about. So about decolonizing, about parenthood, about lineage and legacy and problems um, and so sort of in these. Hold on. Do we have individual slides of each? Did I
There's
send that to
only
you?
the purple, this
Oh
one.
yeah. Also, in addition to the 4, I made 4 other paintings that you're going to see that are monochromatic. And the monochromatic ones, there's only this one in the show, and then there's like 3 other ones. They were like a tangerine color, like a ginger color, and like a acid green color.
The green is here.
Oh yeah, the green is
Right?
here.
Yeah, the green is here.
Sorry. So the green one is here. And so you'll see those there. And I also painted these in tandem as I was also making the poems. So they're all informing each other. And this is why it was important for me to tell Bianca what these poems were about, because they jump from one to another to another. And there's like little like clues from one poem and from one painting, and they sort of go back and forth. So, for example, if you look at this one at the very end here, and then if you go to the show after, you can look at it closely. I'll just talk about this one because there's so much to talk about, so I'll just pick one thing. So this guy here is the pacemaker, and its body is made out of a whole bunch of pitcher plants. So, so Nepenthes. I know Nepenthes because my son is like into science, and he watches all these like science videos, and he knows like the Latin names for things. Like Nepenthes is a pitcher plant. Anyways, so this is the pitcher plant, and when I was painting this, I was thinking, and it is directly referenced in the poem that we first read in panel 4. So I was looking, I don't even know how my search was, but this is what you do when you're a painter or whatever, you're an artist. You find inspiration, and research is literally everywhere you are. And I came across this one article talking about a pitcher plant that was in Kew Gardens. And it was in the archives. And then they had seen it and they had mislabeled it. They thought it was like one species. But when they when they had looked into it again, they had discovered it was another species, and it was from the Philippines, and actually it was already extinct. And the reason why I was really attracted to it, I mean, the whole botanical thing, sure, I can talk all about that. But when I saw the article and I saw the picture of the pitcher plant, it was this like dried up, crumbly, like beige and brown thing. It was not really nice to look at. And then it had a long stem. And it looked exactly like what my umbilical cord looked like, that my dad, like I said, kept in his wallet, which I had no idea people did that, but he did. He kept my super gross umbilical cord in his wallet, and it was pressed in between this paper. And he had it in there until it basically like disintegrated. So I thought it was really beautiful. And because I talk a lot about umbilical cords and placentas in the work, it sort of ties in together again, this idea of like attachment and detachment and lineage and all that stuff. So yeah, so there's all, and that's like in all the paintings, there's so much in there.
Yeah. Again, this idea of comprised of two parts, but housed in one body, the umbilical cord and the cord and the placenta, which we talked about earlier, sort of reminds me of that. We've talked a bit about sort of displacement, learning a new language, having different personalities depending on which language we speak. Of course, we're the same people, but there are all these nuances. And I wanted to read a couple of excerpts. I have more, but I want to read just two for just for the sake of time, because I feel like again this kind of reminds me of this idea of two parts, one body, fragmentation, these different parts of ourselves existing within the same within the same body or within the same psyche. This is the passage I'm about to read is from the foreword of an edited volume called Letters of Transit, which was edited by Andrea Assiman, who's an Italian-American scholar and writer, but he was born in Alexandria, grew up in Alexandria, but also has Turkish roots, Jewish roots. And this volume he put together, and I think the word exile is really interesting to think about as well, because we're not in exile, and historically exile was sort of the most severe punishment that you could give to somebody is to send them into exile. But the way that it is referred to in this body of work and the essays that are in this volume, the definition of an exile is a bit fluid, and there are questions around, is it similar to being an emigre? Is it similar to being an immigrant? Or what is the difference between these words? And anyway, I will read the passage because it illustrates, I think, what I'm trying to say. What does it mean to be an exile? How does exile alter someone? How does it reinvent one? What is exile? When does it go away? Does it ever go away? What is the difference between, say, a refugee and an expat, or between an immigrant and an emigrant, or between the uprooted and the unrooted, the displaced, the dépaysés, the evicted, the émigrés? People who didn't just lift themselves up with their roots, but who may have no roots left at all. Eventually, of course, sorry, this is the second time it happens. Eventually, of course, one does stop being in exile. But even a reformed exile will continue to practice the one thing exiles do almost as a matter of instinct: compulsive retrospection. With their memories perpetually on overload, exiles see double, feel double, are double. When exiles see one place, they're also seeing or looking for another behind it. Everything bears two faces. Everything is shifty because everything is mobile. The point being that exile, like love, is not just a condition of pain, it's a condition of deceit. I wanted to read this because it reminded me again of two parts, one body, but also of the kind of duplicity of the condition of sort of being away from home, and like the relationship we have with home, and how home becomes like a complete construct, or maybe how language even becomes a complete construct, something that we mythologize or that becomes otherworldly, sort of like your work, Marigold. But anyway, just wanted to hear your thoughts about some of these words that we just read.
Hello. I definitely love the part where you're looking forward and back, because I love thinking about the word diaspora as something that's three-dimensional. It's not something that's one defined as one thing, and it can be really defined differently depending on your experience and sort of like who you are, you know. And I also like to think about words in a three-dimensional way. So I look at them holistically. You know, so when I think about diaspora, I think about that holistically. When I talk about resilience, I think about resilience holistically. So, for example, as a person in diaspora, why do we even have to be resilient? Is that something that we have to do? Like, why? And so it brings up all these other things. And when I think about um, homeland, it's also not glorified. I don't think about the Philippines in this glorious way. You know, there's always like a hypercriticality to everything that I think about, and I think that's really important when we talk about language and we talk about like where we're situated and who we are, and on all the layers on top of that. So, I did appreciate that text.
Yeah, me too. That text, I feel like I'm still processing it, even though you gave it to us beforehand. But something about the compulsive retrospection and seeing double in things. And I think to me, I also find myself just yearning a lot. Um, and in this, like, I don't know, I feel like one of the things that I'm really afraid of is losing like the pulse of what is important back home, and that not aligning with the person that am here. And so I think about that a lot, and I think about, I guess, like family and loved ones that I've left behind. And yeah, I really question there's a hesitance for me to go back sometimes, and I mean part of it is also just financially. It's really expensive, but because I think sometimes I'm afraid to meet the people that I once knew, and that we both have different expectations of each other. Um, and so, yeah, I'll leave it there.
Yeah, it's funny. I met someone recently who is Lebanese like me, and she hadn't been back in 30 years. She lives here in Calgary. And I was asking her, why haven't you been back? And she said something sort of the opposite of what you're saying, but it felt like it made sense. She described it as having like a mistress, like that this country or this other place is like a mistress, and that she had to cut ties off completely, otherwise she'd have to keep going back to it, which I thought was like an interesting way to sort of think about home. But anyway, before we open it up to questions, I had one other quote. This is more for you, Bianca. One of my favorite writers is also a translator, Lydia Davis. She's quite known for, more recently, she's been quite known for translating Madame Bovary, but she's translated a lot of other things more recently. And she has this book of essays, and one of the essays is about the pleasures of translation. So I want to read this, and I want to hear your perspective, and if you can relate to that while you were working on Marigold's poetry. So this is pleasure number 6. In this activity, you are entering another person. You are speaking in his or her words. You are writing what he or she wrote. You become a sort of shadow person, for a time insubstantial. In this, you are like an actor. It is restful. When I am translating Proust, I am no longer quite myself. I am here, but hidden in the shadow or subsumed within the identity of this other writer. I am only part of the whole of what I usually am, and it is a relief from myself. You develop the ability, if you did not have this before, to be both yourself and another, or multiple others, at the same time. Did you feel like while you were working on Marigold's poetry that you were kind of becoming less of yourself, more of Marigold, or vice versa, I guess?
Maybe not less of myself, but I think this what this person speaks about is I can truly relate to it, because as someone who has like an acting background, that is kind of the approach that I took. You know, like I had access to your paintings, and I kind of lived, or like I had, like I was, like the words in the painting made me imagine what the circumstances are, and like what it was like. Like I kind of saw it as a character, like getting into a character, And for me, that's more like seeing what the similarities are between me and this person. Even though like I've not obviously have had the experiences of what a mother was, but I drew from what I know of it. Like, like I drew from the experiences of my mom, and like there was a series of questions that really stood out to me. I can't recite them now, but it's in one of the poems, where it's asking like, how do I teach? I don't want to butcher it. Please read it. um, but that was, I think, those series of questions were so. It was so easy to do that because I felt like the character was speaking so clearly, as to what, I guess, the intention is and what they want. So that was really clear for me. And yeah, yeah.
Cool, thank you.
Thank you.
I would like to open it up for the audience to ask questions. Um, don't be shy.
As the son of an immigrant, and I was an immigrant in Germany for 3 years, one of the things that helped me was this statement, which is maybe controversial, and that is, we have no right to security. If we have no right to security, we don't really have a right to a homeland. We don't really need to be thinking about it because our lives will be based on insecurity. Any comments?
Sorry, who made that statement? Are you quoting somebody or?
Well, I mean, I feel like everyone should have a right to security. That is a human right. So it's kind of like a pessimistic quote, but I can see that being written from a perspective where you're trying to lessen your expectations so you don't fail, so you don't become disappointed. Um, and perhaps there's like different generations of people where, again, you and then sorry, and this is really coming from me, where I'm really coming from a place where I'm trying to decolonize, right? This is something that we think about. Um, and so, who then does have a right to security? And so, is it the people that have more means than you? Is it the people that have more access? They get the security, and then the people that don't just don't, and they're treated less than human. So, um, I feel like there was a time, I think, when I think about my parents, for example, and their immigration, and they started from nothing. We lived in one room, all of us on one mattress in Scarborough, Ontario, until we got ourselves, until my mom um, found a job where we could afford an actual apartment. And I could see her maybe pushing us into speaking English because it was like a survival thing, right? Um, but then, there's the generations after where you realize that your worth, you realize your value, and you realize your worth as humans, and where you come from is important and special, and that difference is celebrated and should be embraced and uplifted. And I think those are messages that, when I think about cross borders, across borders, that's the important thing, right? Is we're nothing without community. So I feel like that's sort of how I think about it.
Yeah, I think this notion of, I don't know what you said about insecurity. Um, yeah, but towards the end you say something about that life is, I don't know, something about insecurity. I don't know what the last part of that quote was. If could you repeat it? Sorry.
I don't know which part it is, but I just had a conversation recently with an immigrant, a Dutch immigrant, and the family survived war and lost everything. And so I think, and then I talked to her about the fact that immigrants tended to be restless kinds of people. My parents were restless, and they move countries because they are restless. So that's a part of that whole notion of insecurity. Do we really have a right to security, or is it something a part of the human condition? I don't have an answer. I'm just
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think we do have the right to find what security means to us, and I think of when I hear the word insecurity, I think of like someone who has constantly has to have their guards up and to have a really unregulated nervous system. And I'm like, oh, that I don't wish that for anyone, because that's a way that I've lived for a lot of my life, and I know that I even come from a very privileged, like, I know our immigration story is like we had money to do it, and my dad was the one who proved that we were worth investing in. Sorry, that sounds, but there are a lot of reading comprehension tests and speaking tests, and like you have to prove that you're going to do something for where you're headed. And in this case, in our case, it was we landed right here in Calgary. Um, but when I think of yeah, like just that uneasiness, I don't know if that is always how I want to live. Yeah.
I think, yeah, security, 100%. Let's all get it. Let's all get it.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I relate to the restlessness. I definitely do, but I also just moved here 2 years ago. I think it's different for somebody whose parents were immigrants, but I think the restlessness maybe is always there. You're right, but I think absolutely agree. We all have a right to feel secure or to security, but I think the bigger question really is who decides who gets to have that. Because, yeah, thank you for your question. Any other questions?
Hi, thank you for your talk. It's been really good. I listening to this, I started thinking back to something I've been thinking about quite a bit with people I'm really close to as immigrants, and something that always comes to mind for me is immigrating at a young age. It comes to a point where you don't feel like you belong where you came from anymore. For example, for me, I don't feel like I belong in Korea anymore. People there will notice I have an accent when I speak in Korean. People notice I'm a bit different. And, there people will call me an Americanized person, whereas in Canada, still I have people tell me that, oh, like, you're an immigrant, you're Korean. Like, so, like, it's like this feeling of not fully belonging here, but not fully belonging there either. And I really like the notion of shapeshifters and being two parts of one, but also not really belong in either. And sorry, this is a bit of a lead up to my question, but as a visual artist, I've considered incorporating Korean elements to my art, but often worry about the judgment of like, okay, what will like a true Korean, like even using those words kind of feel weird for me, but what would like a true Korean feel about me using this? Is this appropriating in some ways? And what does the Western audience like? Would they even care? And there's a bit of that. So I was wondering if you ever struggled with similar feelings or how you battled with that.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. I think something that I do in my work as a playwright is always to incorporate culture and language. And have there been times where I want to, or there's moments where I think about, oh, what would my family back home or my friends back home think about this kind of work? And it's so nerve wracking to think about because yeah, like you, I don't want that like notion of well, misrepresenting our culture, but also, um, I don't know. I think something that I'm afraid of is thinking that people back home will think that, oh, that's just like a Canadian way of thinking about it. But but the reality is, I do exist in both places. So I think this is like the work that I create, because it's so personal to me. Um, I have to live in that, or at least try to do it with the least shame that I can conjure up. And you know what? The more I do it, the more it gets easier. And some people will have opinions about things like casting, or like, that does not look like a real Filipino to me. That does not sound like a real Filipino to me. Something that happened in the last show that I did. But those things can exist, and they can be real for that person. But I think like knowing what your intentions are and staying true to those intentions, that is like huge for me as an artist.
Thanks, Bianca. Thank you for your question, too. That's an awesome question, and thanks for sharing about yourself. Um, yeah, I mean, to start at the beginning, definitely there are moments where, and I felt it very early when I'd go back to the Philippines, where I really didn't feel like I was like accepted as somebody that there's a term actually in Tagalog. It's called balikbayan, and it's like translates to like a person who returns, I guess. To yeah, and they would just like kind of give you that name and say that is you, that you are a balikbayan, and they would talk about me in Tagalog. And I could understand everything they were saying, and I was like, that's not nice. And I knew everything they were saying, but I couldn't say it. Or they'd be like, you're not Filipina, you're not Pinay. And I was like, I am. And I was born here. And then they just, so again, because I didn't have the language skills, I felt kind of like um, dismissed. And then, obviously, being an immigrant and struggling through language, experiencing racism on a daily basis for, years and years, it's like, yeah, of course you don't feel like you belong. But the work that I make now talks about all of that, about this feeling of being in between, liminal spaces, liminal mentalities, incorporating that in the work, fully knowing that certain relatives or like certain Filipinos that would live in the homeland might not relate to anything that I'm saying at all, and vice versa, and that can exist to at the same time, and that's okay. But in terms of like impregnating my work with iconography that's like specific to the Philippines, yes, I do it, and I love to do it. And um, I'm fully aware too that, like, for example, people in the Filipinos might be like, how is that an aswang? Like that character that I was talking about in the beginning. It's like that's not how it's understood. That's not how we know it, and that's intentional because it is sort of removed from that, and then it's been reconfigured many times. So I like that incongruity that can happen as well. I think it's important. Those spaces that is it's important to have in the work.
Thank you.
I just want to say thank you so much for sharing this like beautiful pieces of artwork and words. Um, the, the these pieces of work that Filipinos would see, like Filipino Americans, is deeply healing. Just to even just see it visualized and like seeing some of that pain through art. I just wanted to ask, like, what inspired you guys, like, to begin this healing and to kind of use art and expression of being who you are to authenticate it? Thank you.
So I would say that the time, like I can pinpoint the moment when I decided to make art about this stuff, this topic. Um, I was in my last year of my undergraduate degree. So I did my BFA at the University of Calgary. And at that point, I was really thinking about like making work that mattered. You know, I was kind of tired of like making work that was like assignment driven. And so that was sort of like the first foray into it. And that's when I started thinking about language. Um, but then I didn't really fully develop it until I did my master's. And so I did my master's degree at Concordia University, Montreal. And when I moved there, again, I had moved across the country to go to school. And all of a sudden it kind of like brought back these ideas of like moving and sort of being uprooted and like not knowing, not understanding anyone because everyone was speaking French. And I was like, I don't speak French. So again, so then I started thinking about, and so I dove really deeply into then my heritage at that point and really wanting to make considerate work that really mattered to me and that would matter to other people if they wanted to connect with it in some way.
Yeah, I also went to the University of Calgary for theater, and we actually had the most people of color in our graduating class. And I think that did wonders for me because so I used to straighten my hair every day, and it was in that class where I don't know how people found out that I have naturally wavy hair, but they were like, "We want to see more of this." And I felt like that encouragement from fellow classmates who had similar lived experiences, and like the act of sharing those experiences to each other was what uplifted me. And we did all sorts of plays that are, you know, you had to be British or whatever. I just like did not, I could not see myself in these monologues or um, again, this is not an original experience. I know a lot of folks who have had this, and I decided for myself. I stopped auditioning for a lot of the big stages here because they don't put on plays that mattered to me, and I wanted to share my own stories, and we kept, you know, being given the feedback of like, well, if those theater companies don't do stories like yours, then make them, which is so easy, right? But honestly, that was where I found the path to the theater that I create now, and I think like even if I see one person feel seen or celebrated, that's what matters to me, and that's what carries me through. Yeah, yeah. I don't know if I answered that question.
Thank you. First, thanks for the amazing talk. Secondly, I'd love to hear more about the botanical imagery as well as like potentially like the placenta imagery and umbilical cord stuff. I know it's mentioned directly in the poem, but I'd love to hear more about like the symbolism and how it shows up in different ways.
Yeah, absolutely. So when looking at like the four, obviously you can see that they're connected, right? Like the two poles running down the bottoms. And you'll see there's an actual sculpture in the Ring Gallery that emulates the same kind of form, except the sculpture has these undulating waveforms, and they're actually three-dimensional sound waves. And they're sound waves that have been carved in wood that are of the sound waves of me speaking my broken Tagalog. So actually reciting this line of the poem. So these ideas of connection is really what I was thinking about when I think about placenta, I think about umbilical cord. I had talked about how this is like this organ that you grow, it has one purpose. That's it. Its purpose is to to nurture your infant, your fetus, your baby, and then the umbilical cord brings nutrients in and brings nutrients out. And what I did, what I didn't realize, and it sounds so weird to think about this, but is that placenta is actually has the DNA of both, like, so it has like the DNA of my husband and me. It's not just like my DNA. Like it's just so interesting. And of course it doesn't, it seems like, well, that would make sense because your baby is like, but I just didn't think that this organ that my body made would be that, you know? So just thinking about all sort of these like transformations and these sort of adaptations that our bodies make and that we make in order to survive and to be resilient. That's sort of like impregnated in all of the work. And you're going to see like a lot of different botanical elements in the work. So you're going to see this gumamela down here, which is hibiscus. And so, for example, in the Philippines, that grew everywhere. That was like this main flower that I saw. It was the size of my head. And when I think about tethers to my homeland, tethers to heritage, and things that transport you back, I immediately go to sensorial memories. So smell, touch, taste, visual things, right? Those are things that can immediately transport you. So the botanical elements are kind of an easy way for me to talk about that stuff because we eat them, they make fruits, they make seeds, and then those things, it continues in it generationally. So again, all of that stuff, you see how it's kind of cross-referencing itself and going through and in and out. And that porousness of my work is the way that I like to think about the porousness of individuals and experiences, you know, that it's mutable, it's always evolving, it's always changing. So just to get back to what you were saying, some more elements that you're going to see are kind of like skeletal structures of some plant life. So the poles, sometimes it's sort of the inside dried out skeleton of like what a cactus would be. So if you look closely, that's what that is. I've done a lot of I spent a lot of time in desert environments, which is really interesting because, again, I'm like from this like humid tropical climate, but I think in another life I must have been like some kind of cacti or something because I'm so drawn to dry, arid environments. Hence, I live in Calgary, Alberta. But so yeah, a lot of the landscapes that you'll see are a collage, like a visual collage of a lot of the places that I've lived and had like a real interaction with. So, arid landscapes, tropical landscapes, etc. And that will be reflected in the plant life and also in the colors of the sky. So yeah, you're welcome. Oh,
I have a question about the impact of the Filipino, or I mean the Philippines landscape on your artwork. Um, when I was quite younger, I traveled from Manila to Cavite City, and the two end pieces, they remind me of the landscape. There wasn't really a lot of growing things. I saw the occasional like palm tree, um, but it seemed like a very barren landscape. It was just like houses and roads and more houses and roads.
you can also answer that too. So yeah, with landscape in the Philippines. So like I said, I was born there. Spent 7 years, almost 7 years of my life there, and then went back probably 5 times. I'm actually going back next week for a month. This is the first time I'm going back in 11 years. So I'm going to feel like the real Balik Bayan for sure. And I'm going to be bringing my child, my husband. They've never been to Asia, so it's going to be exciting. Um, but yeah, the landscape of the Philippines, it changes. It's just like Canada, right? There's areas that are really lush, jungly, there's areas that are beachy, there's areas that are flat, and there's also areas that are mountainous. And so I have traveled a little bit in the Philippines, but not extensively in the south, middle, north. And so my travels have informed the landscapes that you'll see as well. Mainly, not so much the topography, though sometimes, and not in these paintings, but in my sculptures. You'll see them in these like wooden sculptures that I've created. But what is more present is actually the plant life. So that I really think about. I also, on Instagram, I follow this really amazing biologist. I follow a lot of like female scientists, and their research brings me a lot of inspiration. So there's this one biologist from the Philippines, and she talks about like native trees in the Philippines and native animals, and so that is really like a source of inspiration for me too, because I don't have access to that country. I don't, and that's the thing is when you're in diaspora, you're not surrounded by your homeland 24/7. You're not even surrounded by it like barely. So what I get is fragments of my culture, fragments of like memories, and then I hang on to that for dear life, and and I hang on to it, and that's what my artwork is made out of, fragments, and I cobble it together to make something whole.
Did you hear that too? Was it?
Yeah, it was saying, "Wrap it up."
Oh, right. Was
No,
that a
it's not.
sign?
I'm just making that up, but it probably is time to wrap it up. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. Bianca, do you want to answer maybe the rest of that
I
question?
think to contribute for that
Okay.
one.
Do you want to take one last question before we do wrap it up?
Only if there's one, but if there isn't, don't. We're
Yeah.
not going to force it.
Yeah.
But if there's one that just needs to come out, no, good.
Okay,
Oh,
just the
there is.
one.
There's one. There's.
Sorry, hopefully this will be a quick one, but I'm just curious to hear about your experience on after the practice of, speaking Filipino together or Tagalog, sorry, and then translating it as well together. How did that inform your practice afterwards? Whether that be Bianca for you with, the play that you did, or I know like in your lifestyle you said, you like lived a bit slower even in like fast-paced environment, or like for you Marigold, like with your own like practice of art. Yeah.
Wow, that's such an interesting question. Yeah, I think for me, my biggest takeaway was like the thing about the personality thing that I said earlier. Like I really thought it was like I just wanted to nurture you during that moment. Like I'm like I know you can do it. So like I don't know if I don't know if I was able to say it out loud, but every time you said a word right, like I just felt so proud of you. Like and also I wanted to be like, now say it like you mean it, like say it like 100%. I don't think this came out really during our
feel
session,
that a little
but
bit. I could feel a bit of that vibe, and I was like, I don't know, I can't.
yeah, and I feel like that's the thing about like with coaching a little bit. Like it's you have to kind of gauge
Yeah.
what someone is what someone is ready for in terms of
Yeah.
like a note like that. But in my heart, I don't know, like watching that was so interesting, and I think that made its way a little bit into like the life of my character, and this yearning of like, and the frustration too of like I used to have this, and like it was like this grasp, and maybe it didn't come out in words, but definitely in like the feeling of one of my characters for sure.
For me, I feel like my takeaway from it is that it made me more confident in like being able to include my language and really try with my language skills. Like I really want. I know I'm not going to be able to speak to my child in Tagalog fluently. That really breaks my heart. But we try to have him speak. And my husband's Ukrainian, so he speaks Ukrainian to him, and I teach him some Tagalog words like kalat, clean up your kalat. That means mess, and he totally knows it. He's just like, I made a kalat. I'm like, yes, you did. But yeah, it just is making me more confident, and I'm really grateful to be working with Bianca on that. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you for all your questions.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marigold
nice.
and Bianca. And thank you to Melody, who's our AV tech, doing all of the work behind the scenes. Thanks, Melody. Thanks, everyone. The Marigold's poetry book is available as a downloadable PDF on our website. So if you came here too late and there are no more physical copies, you can still read the really lovely poetry that Marigold and Bianca translated. Thanks again.
And you
for
can print it
tonight.
out and make your own.
You can print it out.
Yeah,
and make
do
your own.
it.
All right. Thanks, everyone.